go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Lunch with the Finance Bunch on Dash Talk Radio. I'm Charline.
And I'm God's gift, Matthew. Welcome, welcome.
Hey, Matt.
How are you doing today, Char?
Guess who we have as our guest today?
Can you please inform me? Because you're over there smiling from ear
I
to
know.
ear.
I'm excited because it's my really good friend, Linda Powell. We grew up together.
Oh, word. So the New York is about to come out
The
of you
New
today.
York is about to just take over the room. Linda is an author. She's a retired school teacher, and she's the mom of a beautiful, beautiful young lady.
Trifecta over here.
You better believe
Special
it.
guest.
Yes. Hey, Linda.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me.
Of
How
course,
are you doing today,
of course.
love?
Linda
I'm
wrote a
good.
book. Linda wrote a book, and it's called Resilient. We Don't Stop. Music not only saved the Bronx, it brought her, Linda, along so many others into the light and so many others into the light. And we're going to talk about my era of music.
Hey, I'm ready for it. I like
Which
the old
is the
school
original hip-hop.
Of course, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the essence.
Oh, yeah. So now, Linda,
Yes,
I know
Shirley.
you as a school teacher and all of that. What made you decide to write a book?
Well, actually, I always wanted to write my story, but back around 2010, I started to research my family history, genealogy, and did my family tree, traced it back to 1805 in
Wow.
Duluth, Georgia.
Oh, that's
And
what's
at
up.
that time, my second cousin, my mother's cousin, he gave me pictures of my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother,
Oh, wow.
along with my great-great-aunts. And I looked at the pictures, and I looked in these women's faces and looked in their eyes, and I said, I wonder what their stories were.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when my great-aunt died, they threw out her Bible, and we all know that old black women kept
Yes.
records of family history in
In the
their
Bible.
Bibles. And they threw out her Bible and all her records, and all I had was these women's pictures, and looked in their eyes. I was able to match each one of my grandmothers and my aunts with a current relative of mine, with a cousin of mine. Even one of my great aunts looked exactly like me. So
Wow.
it's amazing how generations pass on.
Did you do a
Right.
double take?
I took a double take, especially when I saw the one that looked exactly like me. I was like, wow, I wonder what her story was.
Right.
So that same cousin that gave me the pictures, he's a retired professor, and also he does interim acting provost at different colleges.
Okay.
He also wrote a poetry book where he had wrote poems about some of these women. So I was able to put that on the Ancestry.com tree along with their pictures. But I said, when people go back and they see my picture 100 years from now,
Right.
they're going to see my book.
Absolutely.
They're going to be able to read what my story was, because we grew up in an amazing era.
We really
with
did.
the beginning of hip-hop right outside our back door.
Literally
they
right
brag
outside
to me
our
all
back.
the time.
Yeah.
So they're like, this young generation don't know what's going on.
No.
We lived in a real era.
And it was exciting because it was new music that no one had ever heard.
Absolutely. It
Right?
was definitely groundbreaking for sure.
Yeah, and it had a rhythm to it that was different. And I was telling Linda in the car, on my way, when I came out here originally and went to school, no one had heard of hip hop. It was 1976. And no one had heard of hip hop. They were like, what? What is that?
What
And I
is
was trying to
that?
explain it. And then finally we got our first album, right?
Yes, oh yes.
Yeah. And
We had hit the map.
we
right?
hit the map.
Yeah,
And then a
right.
friend brought the album out here, and I played it for my friends at school, and they didn't know what it was. They loved it, and everybody was rocking, but they didn't know what that was. So, yeah. And then, of course, as time went on, it got more and more popular, and now it's the most, lucrative genre of music out there,
Absolutely.
right?
And
Numero
who would
uno.
have thought that it would
Who would have
have
thought
came this far and would have lasted this long?
this long?
Really?
Right,
Really?
because
I
they
never
said it
thought-
was a fad.
Oh yes, definitely thought it was a fad. Okay, my parents even said, "Oh, we grew up on rock and roll, and it didn't last, and this won't last either." Look at it; it's
Yeah.
still here, and we'll
40
still
years
be here,
later.
right?
Or more.
Absolutely.
And so someone needed to tell the story of how it originated, because there are many stories out there.
And most of them aren't true. I'd like to
Yes,
go on
I
the
was
record.
like, we got to get to the bottom of the truth, y'all.
We
Yeah.
really need to get to the bottom of the truth, but there are so many of us who witnessed it, who are not speaking up, or speaking up but not being heard. So I decided, well, even if no one reads my book, which I know someone will, but if anyone really wants to know how it started, I was there, I witnessed it, I gave my account of it, of what I saw, not what has been fed to the media, not what the new generation and the current generation thinks happened, because they play a game of telephone and they pass down these stories over the years, and they're taking them to be gospel.
And they're
Absolutely.
certainly not that.
They're definitely not that.
Because
So
we were talking in the car, and I was like, "What? Wait, that's not what happened.
happened. That's not how it happened.
That's
Remember?
not how it happened.
Exactly.
But
So you have people definitely taking credit that don't need to, and writing people out of history that don't need to be.
definitely.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because some of the so-called, fathers of hip hop came along after the fathers of hip hop created hip hop,
Really.
and the ones who actually created hip hop didn't get credit for it, and that's really unfortunate.
Unfortunately. And then there's always been a dispute as to where it began. Well, everyone has their story, as I say. Everyone has a story. Write your story. You don't agree with my story, fine. Then dispute it. We can battle it out in books. but write your own story. But I gave my account of how I saw it. And I may not have seen it accurately, because I always felt like a little kid in a candy store running behind Charline and my big sister and their friends, and I was looking in. Now, things may have happened, and I may have perceived them differently because I was young, and I may not have been told the whole story. You guys probably sheltered me, but I gave my account of it.
Well, you did a pretty good job. We obviously didn't shelter you enough, because you got a lot of stuff in here that I'm like, how did she get to that party? How did she know about that?
And what were you doing over there?
Exactly.
What were you doing on that street? That's what you were asking me the other day. But I was there, and I was in a lot of places I had no business being in. I will attest to that. I should not have been there. I'm lucky to be here. I thank God that I am here.
He was protecting you.
Yes, he did. He looked over me. He watched over me. He still watches over me every day.
So now let's get into the book. Now, you are originally from New York.
Yes, born and raised. I was born in Manhattan, grew up on the Lower East Side. Everyone knows it as LES, and Delancey Street, Orchard Street. Lived down there for
The best shopping in America.
And the best
It used
pizza
to
in
be.
America.
Yes, all right. Okay. All right. And everyone knows Cat's Deli,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
Essex Street Market, and Houston Street. And other people want to know why we don't call it Houston, but in New York, if you're a real New Yorker,
It's
you call
Houston.
It's Houston Street. And then when I got to be 10 years old, we moved from that area up to the Bronx, and it was a whole nother world. Whole different world coming up to the Bronx, and just the elevated trains were enough, because I was only used to underground subways, which is what they have in Manhattan.
Which made the ground rattle.
Yeah, which made the ground rattle. But coming up to the Bronx in 1970, during a time when the Bronx was really on the verge of ruins.
It really was.
It truly was. I mean, with all of the rubble, the buildings, and all of the decay that was going on in the Bronx. The streets were not safe. The gangs were fighting
They
each
had
other.
taken over.
The gangs had taken over, and everybody had a turf. Everybody had a territory. You weren't allowed to go in this neighborhood or that neighborhood.
Across this street.
Oh man, so I could definitely imagine there was a lot of tension throughout New York. As a whole.
Absolutely.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. And there were all types of gangs, black gangs, Hispanic gangs, white gangs. When the sun went down, you better be on your own turf.
You better be in your own neighborhood.
Right.
And it's like what happens here in LA, but this was 50 years ago.
Yeah, this was back in the 70s. And like I said, the Bronx was probably the worst borough in New York because of all of the decaying buildings. A lot of the buildings were being torn down, burnt down, and a lot of the landlords had abandoned them. And
We had a lot of empty lots.
we had a lot of empty lots, buildings that had fell down. burnt down. A lot of landlords were making money off of having buildings burnt down for insurance purposes and stuff. And the Bronx was the forgotten borough, and people were living in poverty and crime, and the streets were not safe. The streets were not safe.
You know it's bad when the projects is the place to live.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. So now let's talk a little bit about the book. Now, when we're talking about, like, you know, how music entered into this, you know, decaying, not even neighborhood, but a whole borough was like in ruins, right? For the most part. Yeah, there were parts that were affluent, but not as many as there were that were decayed. So as you moved into the projects right around the same time that we did, right? And so when did music come into that for you?
Well, as I said, we moved there in like 1970, and the area that we grew up in had 7 major government housing projects,
yes.
right? And naming those projects, we had, starting with Bronx River to Bronxdale, where I was at, to Monroe, where you were, to Classen Point.
Right.
We include Sackwarn, Soundview houses, and Castle Hill houses.
Right.
So there were like
definitely
7, heavily populated with 7 government housing projects within, I would say, like a 7-mile radius.
Oh, wow.
And in between those were sprinkles of privatized housing, private-owned housing developments.
Right.
So we also had Trio houses, we had Lafayette houses, Rosedale Gardens, we had Jamie Towers, and Carroll Gardens and Leland. So we just were surrounded by buildings and private houses within, also a little bit of private homes within those areas. But I saw the Black Spades had started in my backyard, which was one of the most notorious gangs in New York City at that time.
Wow.
And I was best friends with the creator's little sister. And me and my little friends used to hang out on the bench in the backyard in the evening times. And all of a sudden, the bigger boys, her brother and some bigger boys, started coming over and taking over our bench and having secret meetings and running us off. And eventually we were like, what's going on? And she came out and said, they're starting a gang. My brother's going to be the leader, and his friend is going to be the vice president, and this and that. And it's going to
like
be
they were starting a corporation.
Right, exactly.
and it's going to be called the Black Spades. And I'm like, what does that mean? That means that people are not going to be able to come over here and come into our projects and harass us or beat us up. And I'm like, nobody comes over here and harasses us and beats us up. And I'm like 10, 11 years old. And she's like, no, this happens at nighttime. When the sun goes down and we go inside, other people from other neighborhoods come over here and try to rob them and beat them up. So they're going to form this gang for protection. And I was like, okay, so can little kids join? No, we can't join.
You said, how can I be down?
Yeah, how can we be down? So we went to her brother and the vice president, and they're like, no, we're going to start another division called the Baby Spades. Y'all could be in that. Eventually they did, and then they were like, you're still too little. You're not old enough to be in that either.
Thank God.
Right, so, but we wanted
can I
to
be a
there.
vice president, a lieutenant, something?
We wanted, so we made our own little gang called the Kings and Queens, but we didn't matter. But the Black Spades actually protected our neighborhood. And they got to grow. They grew and they grew, and they became one of the biggest gangs in New York City.
Wow.
And then there were all these street wars that they were having, and gang wars they were having with other gangs like the Savage Nomads and the Skulls and everything else. And it was getting out of control.
That's when it got really dangerous, when the gangs started to collide. It
It
started out as protection in each community, and then when they would cross the boundaries and collide, that's when it became a problem.
And then actually, I remember there were evenings where we knew that the Spades were coming through because we were the first division. We were the first division of the gangs, and all the other divisions would come to meet up with the president and vice president that lived right in my building or in the next building. And when they were coming through to get ready to go for a gang war, and they would all come and meet, there would be a sea of
Of-
young
yes,
black
black
men with
men.
their colors on and their
Yeah.
glory stompers on,
Right.
and their
Those battle
jean
boots.
jackets with
Oh,
their
yeah, so
colors and
everybody
stuff.
is showing out.
Yeah, ready to fight.
Literally
And-
hundreds.
Yeah, and the police were like outnumbered. It got
So-
to the point where they would tell all the little kids go inside because the police would come and surround the roofs of the projects with shotguns and stuff,
Yeah.
waiting for something to break out. But it just started to get out of control. They were killing each other, stomping each other, and everything. And so they held a forum. One of the television stations, I think it was a TV station, a guy, David Susskind or something, tried to hold a mediation
remember
between
that.
them. And they held and they had them on television, and all of the leaders of the groups came, and they finally came to an agreement. And they decided to stop fighting and stop killing each other because they realized that it wasn't them that they were mad at. They were mad at the system because we were living in poverty.
Yeah.
And they were all living in poverty. And all of a sudden, but as the spades would always march through the neighborhood, there was one particular spade guy that always carried a big boombox and would be dancing all the
Right.
time and blasting music as they marched through the neighborhood. And his name was Mario.
Yes.
And Mario had this big boom box. He always carried it. You would know they were coming. You could hear them
'Cause you
for
could
block.
hear
You
them
could
blocks
hear
away.
the music, and then you come out and see him dancing. Mario started bringing music outside into the projects. Into the projects where I live, which was Bronxdale. We had this street, which we called the Lollipop Circle, because it was more like a cul-de-sac and shaped like a circle. And he would bring the music out there. I remember my little girlfriend, the same one, whose brother was the leader of space, knocking on the door. Mario has music outside. Music outside? What do you mean music outside? He has a turntable and everything.
Everything.
What do you mean? Not a box, not a radio. No, he brought out a record player.
He's like,
So he started with his boombox,
Boombox.
and then the next thing you know, he had his turntables and everything
Everything.
outside.
he's like, we
Outside.
having a block party, y'all.
We're having a
crowd
block
got
party.
bigger and bigger and bigger.
It got so big. I mean, they had block parties, but block parties usually involve food and everything else.
Right.
But this was just
music.
strictly music for the teenagers.
Right.
That's one thing that
Yeah.
I do like about the old school is that I felt like in your areas there was such a sense of community
Yeah.
within them,
Family.
to where like if somebody is bringing a boombox and a music player, it's like it spreads like wildfire throughout the
Yes.
community, to where it's like before you know it, you guys are having a block party, a cookout, everything's going on.
We would literally take over.
The teenagers took over the projects, and then other projects, like I said, there were 7 city housing and all the other private projects. They started hearing about it, so they came over to the Lollipop Circle, and this was back in around 1971 or
wow.
72.
Right.
And it got to the point where it was so crowded that he had to move it to the neighborhood park, which was Rosedale Park, or better known as the Big Park.
Oh wow! So the anticipation grew bigger and bigger
So
every
you
single
can see
time.
what happened. He
Yeah.
went from his boombox,
Boombox,
carrying the music
music,
to the turntable
turntable.
outside in the Lollipop Park, all the way over to the big park
park.
because everybody couldn't fit.
Everybody couldn't fit anymore.
Right.
Wow!
They could not fit
And
anymore.
I can imagine the police were like, "You guys need to shut this down."
Right.
Well,
they-
actually, they supported him because
They would bring out the police dividers so
Right.
that, and support it.
yeah,
Oh, okay, so it's more so as long as nobody's fighting, nobody's shooting.
no one was
Do your
fighting.
thing.
That was it. It helped to bring the Bronx back together, to bring the people in the Bronx back together, because people then who were in those gangs that had now basically dissolved could come from any neighborhood and come over,
to
and
the
they know
party.
that it was safe to come
Yeah.
into our neighborhood and to listen to this music, and everybody just got along. There was never any. There may be a couple of little scuffles, people fighting, but there was no shooting, no knifing or any. It was really safe. It was a big party. We got to meet people from other neighborhoods. All the girls was looking at the guys. All the guys was looking at the
Like-
girls.
Guys were definitely
Yeah,
looking at the girls. I'm like, I would be at that party.
and it was free.
And it was free.
It was free.
There's no
You
cover
didn't-
charges.
You
What?
That's
didn't
right.
have to have any money. You never had to have any money. So it was like, because most of us couldn't afford to go anywhere anyway. So it was like really great.
Now, what happened, Linda? Now, that was going on outside,
Right.
right? Now, remember, 7 miles of projects and poverty, right?
Mm-hmm.
what was going on in the households that created the atmosphere that made the kids want to be outside and not at home? That's what nobody talked about.
Right. Well, you know, a lot of our parents were transplanted up to New York from the South.
Yes. So when we come back, we're going to talk about that. My name is Charline.
And I'm God's gift Matthew.
And this is Lunch with the Finance Bunch on Dash Talk Radio. And we'll be right back with Linda Powell. And we're going to talk more about her book and what went on in those houses.
Absolutely. And shout out to hip hop. Gotta shout out to hip hop, man.
hip-hop.
This is here to stay.
We'll be right back. This is Charline, and we're back with Lunch with the Finance Bunch on Dash Talk Radio. And we're here with Linda Powell, and we just started getting into, we heard a little bit of the history of hip hop, right? Starting in New York, starting in the Bronx, starting in Bronxdale Projects, right? And we went through, there was a huge gang era that I think a lot of people didn't really know about or realize because it was the beginning of where hip hop started. And so we were talking about partying in the streets, but what a lot of people didn't understand was what was going on in the houses of those kids that made them prefer the streets over their houses. So Linda, let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, a lot of our parents were transplanted from the South. They came north with the hopes of finding jobs and creating a better life for their children. And most of them in the projects were hardworking, lower-class parents who were really trying to elevate their families and bring their families up. But some of our parents got there and lost their focus and were so mesmerized with the big city that they just partied. And my house,
about the kids.
My house was one of those party houses where they partied on from Thursday to Sunday. And basically, the kids were on their own. We were outside enjoying the music, and our parents were inside with their friends partying and enjoying their music. And I found that being out at the music outside was an escape from my parents and all their friends and all the drinking and stuff that was going on in the household. And as I got to be a little bit older, I then started to be able to go to parties. So once the music in the street finished, because the police would come and shut it down at a certain hour because of the neighborhood, the people in the neighborhood, of course, needed some peace. Then I would move on to the parties and the community room centers and things like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of kids weren't being watched. A lot of kids weren't being minded. And I know I was one of those, as I was telling Charline, and we were talking about the places where I would wind up at. Parents had no idea where I was. And if they knew where I was, they had no idea as to what was going on in these places. Right? So, but I was just following the music from the streets to the clubs.
Right, because that was the transition. So the music went from a boombox on someone's shoulder and everyone following that music to a small park, to a larger park, and then it outgrew the large park and they had to take it inside. So they took it into the community centers. And so the community centers became the place where you would meet to listen to the music. And it went from the community centers not being large enough to now it started entering the clubs.
Got you.
So it started entering the clubs. But when it was in the park, they had to go inside because the police would come at 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and cut the cords. Because if they told them to go away, they'd leave, wait till the police left, and they come back, set up, and 2 seconds flat,
we're back
and
on,
we'd
y'all.
be back to
Back on.
partying.
We'd
And
be back.
literally, everybody would just kind of sit around and wait. Police would leave, and the party would start again, And so it had to go inside because the police got called more and more often, and it became too expensive.
Did you guys have any lookouts for the police? Because I definitely would have been on the side like, cuckoo.
Yeah, but
it was too many
it
people.
was too many
There
people.
were, I mean, Matthew, there were waves. I mean, there were hundreds of children out there.
Hundreds, like
Listening
you can't
to
even
and
imagine.
dancing and having a good time, and the
Right.
music so loud. No, the
That looked
police
like an
crept up
unofficial
on
summer
us.
camp.
We were out there. That was our summer camp. I mean, we were inner city children from the projects. We didn't have any money to go away nowhere to camp or anything.
The fire hydrant was our
a
swimming pool.
Really?
We'd open the fire hydrant, and that would be the swimming
Swimming
pool.
pool.
Now, when you wrote this book, because you wrote it about the music, you wrote it about your experience, as a child living in a household like that,
Right.
and then following the music because it was your escape. So when you wrote the book, did your family think you were writing about them?
Yes, at first they thought, they went around telling people, she's writing a story about us growing up in the Bronx and growing up in the projects. And I had to correct them and tell them, no, I'm not writing your story. I'm writing my story. Because if you remember, I knew your friends when they came to the door to get you. And you knew my friends when they came to the door to get me. But after we left, we went our separate ways. So I really don't know what you were doing. And I'm telling you, you had no idea what I was doing.
Well, I didn't know what you were doing until I read the book.
I know you didn't know.
And that's
sorry.
a lot.
Surprise, surprise.
That's a
Right.
lot. That's a lot. And then once I started hitting the clubs, like leaving the little neighborhood parties, because with the music and the black spades really started breakdancing. And they would come to the community centers, a group of them, and they would form a circle, and then they would start breakdancing in the middle of the party or whatever. And Charline was a few years older than me, and her and the fly girls would be standing there on the side looking
We
cute.
were the pretty girls.
They were the pretty girls
I was
looking
definitely a
cute
fly girl.
and patting me on top of my head. But me and my little girlfriend, we were like there, like I said, in the candy store looking in. We were like, well, we ain't too cool. We going home. We going to practice them steps. We would come back, and then the next time the spades showed up and form a circle, we would be like, we challenge them.
They would be in the
We
circle.
would be in the circle, challenging them, dropping, spinning, sliding around the floor with them. So we were like some of the original B-girls back there in like 1973 and 74. But then I got a little more elevated and started going to the clubs. And in 1974, I had got a summer job. And at this summer job, one of the girls there said, you need to come to the park up the block from us because this DJ is playing outside. I said, well, I have a DJ in my neighborhood who plays outside. And she said, his name is Herc, and he brings out all this music down in Cedar Park. And I'm like, well, I'm going home to listen to our DJ. He's been playing outside for the last few years, and his name is Disco King Mario. So I'm going home to my DJ. And then I realized about a year later, a girlfriend said, well, come with me to this club that they have over on Burnside Avenue. It's called the Hevalo, and it's for black kids our age. I said, they got a club for us?
We had a club.
We had a club because I was trying to go downtown to Ipanema's and Copacabana and trying Roseland Ballroom and slipping in there and trying to slide in there at the age of 15 or whatever when you're supposed to be 18 and over.
But the Hevalo was our club.
I was determined. But then she said, no, we have a club for us. You ain't got to hide. You ain't got to slide. You ain't got to hide. You ain't got to slide. So we went over there, and there was Kool Herc. Kool Herc is one of the most famous DJs now.
Yeah.
As the creator of hip hop. Kool Herc would also come over to Rosedale Park when the music was out and stand there and watch DJ Mario. His sister would come over to Bronxdale Projects where Mario was in the Lollipop Circle and listen to DJ Mario and text.
So DJ Mario was the guy.
He was
DJ
the guy.
Mario was the guy. African Bambaataa grew up in the neighborhood, and that's when he first started his Zulu Nation. And he would come over and stand there and watch DJ Mario and Tex. And then by this point, they had joined forces with Cool D and his brother Tyrone. And they would come there and watch them. And African Bambaataa would be waiting to get a chance to get onto the turntable.
Oh, wow.
And they gave him like his first outside chances on the turntable.
And see, that's crazy because for people that are like in my age group that like pay attention to like the beginning of hip hop, we would think that it was like African Bambaataa who's like, you know, plastered all over it. That makes it seem like he's like the originator. Grandmaster Flash, who gets a lot of credit.
No,
and
he
Kool
was
Herc
much
in the
later.
Furious Five.
Yeah,
Flash was a lot later. He's a lot younger than us. He was a lot later in the game. And Flash was from Manhattan, right?
Right.
And so he came way later. It was not African Bambaataa. It was not him.
They were there filming documentaries about Disco King Mario back then in the 70s.
Yeah.
They did a segment on 60 Minutes about Disco King Mario back in the 70s before Herc or Bambaataa or any of them.
Herc made it profitable to be in hip hop. Herc took it into the club where you actually had to pay to get in. And they would have dance contests and all the pretty girls and all the, you know, so he made it a little bit more sophisticated. That's what Herc did.
Right.
He took hip hop to another level.
Did the early rappers back in the day, like when DJ Mario was doing his thing on the ones and twos, did he give them the mic to start hosting and it kind of formed into rapping on the mic?
Right, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and they would, you know, if you remember, rap originally was me talking about I'm the best, you talking about you're the best in your neighborhood, what you're wearing, how many girls you have. It was more of a bragging.
Okay.
It started out with bragging.
I definitely would have been a rapper back in the day, then, for sure.
Even Run DMC and other DJs back then, I mean, they give credit to Disco King Mario. Everybody knew Mario. They came all the way from Queens. People were coming all the way from Staten Island to watch Mario outside.
Wow.
Rapping and Tex and Cool D and Tyrone. And a lot of DJs came and watched them and took their stuff back to their neighborhoods or back to the clubs or wherever they came from. I was following everybody. If they had the music out on this side of the Bronx, I was there.
Linda was there.
I was there. They had the
Linda got the scoop.
Yeah, I was following everybody.
We started this conversation by saying Linda was a lot of places she had no business being at the age she was at the time.
But as I also said, I was there because my household, my parents came up from the South, and they got caught up in the party scene in New York, and I couldn't go home because I didn't want to listen to that old folks music all night long. So it was like, I'm going to hang out here in the streets and go to parties and hang out with my friends until they pass out. Then I can go home.
You know, but the thing that I love about your book, one of the things I love about your book is that you talk about yourself and how you grew up and how hard those times were. And then you talk about your family and, you know, the reasoning behind why your life was so hard, a lot of the decisions they made. Right. But the thing that I love about your book is that music was like another character. You know, there were these huge characters in your book, and music is one of those characters.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know, it had a life of its own. You know?
It meant so much to us back in that era. Mm-hmm. It meant so much because we went through a lot back during that time period. And my book not only focuses on the beginning of hip hop in the Bronx, and it tells my story, but it also tells about the hard times. And I encountered out there in those streets a lot of rough times also, and a lot of dating violence and sexual violence, because I was out there and I had no business being out there at that age and trying to hang out with grown people and older people. And music, I can remember music during the good times and what was playing and how we were dancing and what was the latest dance and what we were wearing. But I can also remember those bad times when I was encountering those instances of some type of violence, what type of music I used to soothe myself.
Right, because there was no one to protect us.
There was the Me Too movement we know just started.
Right.
And who were we going to go to and who were we going to tell? And on top of that, I ain't had no business being out there anyway. So I used it to soothe myself and to bring me through a lot.
Yeah. So you know what? I want to talk more about how this played into the successful woman that you are today. Okay. And how you got to that point. All right. This is Charline. We're on Lunch with the Finance Bunch, and we'll be right back with more of Linda's story about her resilience.
Indeed.
Right, in the streets of New York. Lunch with the Finance Bunch on Dash Talk Radio, and we'll be right back. This is Charline. Welcome back to Dash Talk Radio, and we are with Linda Powell, and her book is Resilient. And this segment, we want to talk about her resilience. And I really, really would like to suggest that everyone pick up this book. This book is written so well, and it covers the whole origin of hip hop. But what I like about it is that it really shows what was going on in the life of people who were a part of the movement, but not the voice of the movement.
Absolutely.
Right? So, Linda, I wanted to talk about the way you wrote your book, because I noticed you wrote it in 7 parts.
Correct.
Right? And so could you take us quickly through what those 7 parts are?
Okay, well, I wrote it in 7 parts because the book covers my life span from the time that I was 3 until I was 40. Okay? And starting with the first part, it starts off with at the age of 3 with me being abducted off of the streets of New York and surviving an abduction. And we know most children don't come back from that.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that was one of those critical moments that changed my life. I went to live in Texas at that point with an aunt and uncle who were also very abusive. And that was part 1. And part 2, and eventually, after about 3 or 4 years, I came back to the Lower East Side with my parents and finished running around the streets of Delancey Street and Essex Street and running around the Lower East Side until we moved to the Bronx when I was 10 years old. And at that point, it was a whole different life, a whole different outlook on life. It seemed like it was a new beginning. And that's when we encountered the 7 projects there and all the music and the gangs and the beginning of hip hop and everything. So that would be part 2 of my book. If you really want to know about the beginning of hip hop and what I have to say about it and how my perspective of how it began, that would be the main part, would be part 2, and listening to the music in the streets.
Yes.
We came from a very musical area. Not only did hip hop start there, but we also had right across the street from the projects that I lived at, there was always rehearsal for a group, and that group turned out to be the famous group, GQ.
GQ.
That did Disco Fever,
Yes.
right? And then up the block were some members of the group Chic.
Right.
Within the projects lived Andre Harrell, who started Uptown Records, right? And then across the highway, supposedly, it's rumored that Freddie Jackson came from there,
Right, from Lafayette.
From Lafayette, right? So we came from a very musical area. Right now, also, Remy comes from there, right?
Right.
So that's the area from which we came from. And that would be like part 2 of my book. After that, I go on to, I decided that I needed to straighten up my act because during that time I was living out in the streets. I was hanging in the streets. I was hanging with drug dealers, running around the clubs, carrying guns and stuff. But I was always a good student and my teachers always looked out for me. And I decided I needed to change my life because I almost got ran up on by some cops and I had a gun in my pocket. And I was like, why am I out here doing this when I actually am an A student?
Linda,
and
you were really about that life?
She was about that
I was
life.
about that life.
And a straight A student to
And a
boot.
straight A
Let me
student.
slide my chair over here.
You better get closer.
We friends, right?
Yeah, right. We cool. I was always trying to get out of being a straight A student. I was in like college bound classes and gifted class. I always had my mother come and take me out because I wanted to hang out with the thugs. I wanted to run with the street people. And so eventually I almost wound up going to jail. So I said, let me go ahead and go take these Regents tests and everything. And I
Be true
passed.
to who you are.
And be true to who I am. What am I going to do? I'm getting ready to graduate. I'm not going into the military. It's going to take years for me to get enough money to save up and get an apartment and get out. So what can I do? I can go to college. This way I can get out of my household. That's how I wound up going to college.
Another escape.
Another escape. To get out of my household, I was living with all my siblings. There was 8 of us, and I was sharing a room with 2 sisters. And I said, if I go away to college, I only have to share a room with 1 person. So I'm going to college.
You did the numbers and you were like, I'm out of
going
here.
to college. I wound up applying to college and getting into the top 2 colleges in New York State and not even realizing it because I didn't know anything outside of the city. And I went away to college. So that would be part 3. After college, I came back to New York and I was dating then my ex-husband, I started dating him in high school all throughout college, and he was from Harlem, so I started hanging out in Harlem. And during that time period, as a young adult, got married. Wasn't too sure about the marriage, but went ahead and did it and ran into some complications. He got sick or whatever, and we wound up moving part 5 to California.
Right.
And I was out here in California from the ages of 27 to 30. And this is where I also had my child. And while I was running around the streets with those drug dealers, I was running into and encountering a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of sexual violence. But when I got out here to California by myself, my marriage, it was domestic violence. So part 5 is about coming out here, being married, having a child, encountering domestic violence, and leaving California as a broken and shattered person. Totally shattered and devastated and not knowing where to go and having to start all over. And that's what part 6 is picking up the pieces, persevering, figuring out what was my next move, coming back to New York and seeing that the crack epidemic had taken over. It had devoured the city, devoured my family members, friends, and New York was not the New York that I had left.
Yeah, when Linda and I talked about this when we had moved to California. Linda moved out here. And so New York was just inundated with crack addiction, and we missed it because we were here. Mm-hmm. And so when we went home, we literally had very few and almost no friends left.
No friends. It was just
the crack epidemic wiped them out.
That's insane. That's gonna be absolutely devastating.
You think about you leave and you go away to go live someplace else, and you leave, 20, 30 friends minimum, and you come back and you have 1 or 2.
And I was coming back broken, shattered, single parent, a new mother, all beat up from all this domestic violence, coming back to start over to the comforts of home and looking for my friends and family to surround me and embrace me. And I couldn't find anybody. And when I did find someone, they were walking around like a zombie on crack.
Wow.
Right.
So part 6 was being resilient, persevering, figuring out my next move and deciding I have to go on with my life. I have to make a life for me and my daughter. I have to start over. And at that point, I decided to go back to college because I had not finished at Stony Brook before I moved to California. So I went back to college to finish my last semester and get my degree and then decide where I was going to go from there. And part 7 would be me deciding that I wanted to become a teacher. I had always wanted to be a teacher all through high school. Even when I was running around with the drug dealers part-time after school, I would work in a nursery.
See what I'm saying?
I would work. Yeah, I would get out of school. I would get out of school. Yeah, I would get out of school, go to my part-time job for 2 or 3 hours at the nursery, and then leave and go to the bars and up to hang out with the gangsters up on the corner or whatever. So, yeah. So I had decided then that I wanted to be a teacher, and all while I was in California, I wanted to go back to school, but my husband wasn't supportive about me going back and being a teacher or anything. And so when I came back, I decided it's time for me to make this living for me and my daughter and make this career move. And I went back and got my degree and began teaching in New York City. And I decided that I wanted to give back to my community. So I stayed in my community. And my students, and I taught in some pretty rough areas in the Bronx, and my students would always try to challenge me until I tell them, listen, I'm from these projects. Those same projects you just walked across the street from, I'm from these projects. I'm from these neighborhoods. So then I would gain their respect and be able to get them to sit down and settle down and teach them why they were in the situations that they were in as far as history, because I was a New York City public school teacher, middle school history teacher, and a high school history teacher.
And so I think your background, and like you said, I'm from these streets. So that helped you as a teacher, would you say? To be able to, with the kids, right? Most definitely. Definitely, because they could relate, so they were willing to sit down and learn if they can relate to it. And that's all history is relating it to something relating something from the past to something that's happening in your life now, and that helps you to retain it. Exactly.
Okay.
Now, with your book, and like I said, you wrote it in 7 parts, and it being resilience. And, that could be your first and middle name, Resilient, because you lived through and really not just survive through, but become successful through all of that trauma. And I wanted to find out, like, you've worked in the school system, you retired from that, now you're an entrepreneur, you're a book writer.
Correct.
And so do you consider yourself a entrepreneur personality or an entrepreneurial personality? Which one?
Entrepreneur.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Linda's about her money.
Yes,
she's about to get to her money. Now, because
Tell a lot of jokes. I play a lot of games, but don't mess with my money, okay?
Now, the reason I asked that was because you self-published.
Right. Correct.
Right? So now, could you give us, like, there's a lot of people who want to write books, and once you get the book written, now you have to make the decision whether or not to self-publish or go with a large company. So could you give us a few tips in our last few minutes about what to do about self-publishing?
Well, self-publishing means just that. You are doing it all. You are doing everything. So it's not just writing the book, okay? So you can go with the traditional publisher that will help you and guide you along the way after you have written the book. But with self-publishing, it means that after the book is written, no one's going to find you an editor to edit your book. No one's going to tell you that there are like 2 different types of editors, a line editor and a copy editor, right? So you're going to have to find these people on your own. And you're going to have to find reputable people on your own, as opposed to a traditional publisher who's going to find these people for you, right? So you're out there, and this is a lucrative market right now, and a lot of people are trying to capitalize on self-publishing. So when you approach these people as editors or line editors, do you know really how good they are? And you're handing off your money, as opposed to with a traditional publisher, they're gonna get their money's worth.
Right.
And then from there, you have to go on to, a lot of people don't realize the legal part of it. You have to get your work copywritten. You have to, and that's coming out of your pocket. Some people say, well, as long as it's written, and it's mine, and I have a copy of it, it's copywritten. Or I can just take a copy of the manuscript and mail it to myself, and it's copywritten. Yes, that's true. But for legal reasons, you don't want to wind up in court disputing on who wrote it first. Is it mine? Did they write it? Did I write it first? Or is this person standing here saying, no, it's mine and I wrote it? If it's copywritten, it's yours.
Right.
So you have to pay for that. And then also distribution and stuff. You have to get the Library of Congress number, the ISBN number, and these are numbers, catalogs for the library. These are numbers so that internationally people can find your book. You have to pay for the formatting, the style of the book, the printing of the book. Then you have to make sure that it's being distributed within the right markets and worldwide. Then you have to do the marketing of the book. You have to promote your own work.
So now getting to the marketing of the book, I want to quickly ask about that. How important is social media and PR to a person who is self-publishing?
It's definitely probably the most important aspect of your work, because I thought writing the book was hard. And then when it came time to getting it formatted and printed, I was like, okay, writing was easy now. Mm-hmm. And then after I got the formatting and the printing done, I was like, okay,
now to get it out there.
What am I going to do with the book now? Now I have to get it out there. And if you're not social media suave, you're going to need help with that. Right. So all of these different things, each step is going to cost you. It's definitely going to cost you. You may retain a lot of the royalties yourself if you get it to the point where you're making that type of money where you're getting royalties, but you're going to put a lot of money out.
So make sure you're prepared financially
to do this.
If you're going to self-publish.
If you're going to self-publish.
Now, Linda, I know everybody is probably wondering, where can I get this book? So please tell me, where can we find you? You
can find me at lgpowell.com. That's my initials, LGPOWELL.com. You can go on my website and you will see everything about the book, and you will also see that the book is on Amazon and on Kindle, and you can also get it in just about any other market. It's international. You can get it through Barnes & Nobles and any book catalog.
Wow.
Hey.
Okay. You know what? Get this book. It's called Resilience, and my girl is resilient. And I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, I thank you,
You
for
know
having
how much
me.
I love you.
Oh, I love you more.
We're having a moment, y'all.
We're having a moment. This is Charlene.
And this is God Give Matthew.
And you're on Lunch with the Finance Bunch, and I'm so glad you joined us today.
Tune in to us every Tuesday at noon on Dash Radio.
And watch us on YouTube.
We'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Lunch with the Finance Bunch. I'm your host, Miss Charlene, on Dash Talk Radio.
Tuesdays at noon. I'm God's gift.